They noticed a brown fabric sticking out of the concrete pulled on it, and a skull popped out. Every homicide detective that retires always wonders what's going to happen to their unsolved cases, and I'm very pleased that the torch has been carried by such excellent detectives. All the investigative work from 2003 to 2017 was all trying to identify the victim. It would have taken somebody with knowledge of the building or some sort of background in construction or demolition and time to encase somebody, especially body, in that much cement. My name is Detective Ryan Glass. I'm a detective with the NYPD Cold Squad, and I'm the lead investigator in the Midtown John O 2003 cold case homicide. So this case was very unique in the sense that it was a case having to do with unidentified human remains. All the investigative work from 2003 to 2017 was all trying to identify the victim. Because with any homicide, the most important thing is to have a victim's name too as a starting point. And for this investigation, we just didn't have that. So upon receiving the case file, there was a lot of tremendous and extensive work done. A Detective Gardner, when he picked it up in 2003, responded to the crime scene. I'm retired Detective Gerard Gardner. I was the catching detective for the Midtown Jane Doe homicide case back in 2003. Oh, I remember I was working a night tour that night, 400 p.m. 20 a.m. tour. I was running late. I was stuck in traffic. I get a phone call from one of my colleagues saying there was a skeleton found in the basement of 301 West 46th Street. The building that was there at the time was a 5-story tenement. It was a dilapidated building. There were only a handful of tenants remaining in that building. Restaurant, which faced 8th Avenue, had apparently made some sort of agreement with the owner of the dilapidated building to rent out a portion of their basement, so they hired some construction workers to clear out debris in the basement. They discovered a concrete platform in the northeasternmost corner of the basement, and one of the things that construction workers had told me was that the concrete platform appeared out of place. It appeared to be relatively new in comparison to the rest of the basement. So when they struck it with a hammer, they were surprised to find out that it was hollow. They noticed a brown fabric sticking out of the concrete pulled on it, and a skull popped out. It certainly wasn't a conventional homicide I was used to dealing with. The homicides I've dealt with are pretty much, for lack of a better term, fresh. These are the toughest cases, 'cause oftentimes you have very little to work on. If you don't know who the victim is, you can't immediately determine, or it's extremely difficult to determine, when they were killed. You rely heavily on trace evidence. The anthropologist collected the bones after we were able to access the skeleton and remove the trace evidence that we found. The most notable items were an extension cord, pantyhose, and some glittery pieces of fabric, in addition to a 1969 dime, a bow of a watch, those items, and ultimately the ring on the victim's right pinky. Based on the positioning of the bones, I was informed by the forensic and anthropologist Amy Mundorf that the victim was hog-tied with the pantyhose and the extension cord that was recovered amongst her remains. Every homicide detective that retires always wonders what's going to happen to their unsolved cases, and I'm very pleased that the torch has been carried by such excellent detectives such as Bobby Han and Ryan Glass. So all the investigative work that was done prior to me with Detective Gardner and Detective Robert Han from Manhattan South Homicide, I picked up the ball from that and was waiting on some of the evidence from the crime scene and from her remains to be tested. We used an outside lab for that sort of testing, and a lot of the evidence pertaining to it remains were very degraded, so it wasn't for a lack of trying or investigative work. But we were able to finally get a sample that was suitable enough for our genealogist and our police lab at the Forensic Investigation Division to upload it into the gene genealogy websites. I'm Detective Joe Rodriguez. I'm Linda Dole. I'm a genealogist at the NYPD, so we got our genetic match list back from GEDmatch, and we had a first cousin, which is gold. You don't generally have that happen. So we started with him, and his surname was McClone. So we knew that this was, I guess this is a very good clue, considering that the ring that was found with the remains was a PMCG. Yes, we know we off a pretty good start, yeah. So again, this is a first cousin, so first cousins share grandparents. So we found out his grand or his father, so this is Mr. M. Lowe, and then his father is, and then from there, this is also kind of shocking, he was born in New York. His father was born in New York, and his father only had 3 siblings, so we know that our Jane Doe is going to be a descendant of one of these siblings. So we have Bernard Moan, oops, and we know that we have a sister, just call her H.M. Lon. and then we go from here and we want to look at their children based on the DNA evidence. It could only be the biological child of Bernard McGlone and Patricia Gilligan. They had one child, which is Patricia McGlone, and that was what we were starting with, so we needed to get what was her last proof of life. So now that she's been identified and we could put a name to this case, she's no longer identified as Midtown Jane Doe. Her name is Patricia Kathleen McGlone. She was born April 20th, 1953 in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, and our last proof of life for her that we have is the spring of 1969. Based on her school record, there's some indication that she's may have been pregnant at the time for the reason her leaving school, and there's also evidence that we have her marriage after David and certificate that she had been married, which also lends itself as to why she would have left school in May of 1969. So our next leg in investigation is to figure out the people closest to her at that time, which would have been her husband that she was married to, who was significantly older than her given what we have, and we're trying to establish what type of relationship or situation they may have been in. She was never reported missing from my investigation or the records that I have on her, but prior to getting knowledge that she had gotten married in 1969, we were able to track down an interview that was done with her mother from an unrelated investigation in northern New Jersey having to do with a half-brother that we identified. The half-brother was involved in some embezzlement and check fraud for a company he used to work for, and that company sent investigators out to Brooklyn to speak with his stepmother, which would have been Jane Doe's mom. And from that interview, Jane Doe's mom, who's also named as Patricia, was able to give us a very short but detailed statement to those investigators that I have access to, and I've read, that lends itself to that she has not been seen in some months, and that interview was conducted in May of 1970. This investigation has led me all over the country, all over New York City. The investigation also led me up to Demura Correctional Facility, where I had the opportunity to speak to Joel Rifkin. The serial killer Joel Rifkin was initially in 2003. From news articles was looked at very briefly as potentially committing this homicide again. We did not have a name for her or what have you, but in speaking with him I was told that given the amount of cement that she was found in, that it would have taken somebody with knowledge of the building or some sort of background in construction or demolition and time to encase somebody, especially body, in that much cement. So first and foremost, we want to get information on who did this to her. We want to find out who killed her, given the way she was found. It was a horrific way to be killed, or for any child to end up. We want to establish any sort of connections that anybody could tell us based on her past and history that we know that could shed some light on where she came from, or where she ended up in this position. We would like to talk to anybody that was a neighbor of hers. She grew up on 52nd Street, 3755 2nd Street in Brooklyn, New York. We want to talk to any other neighbors that I may have not spoken to. We want to speak to anybody that may have worked or frequented the nightclub in the basement where she was found. That nightclub was called Steve Paul's. The scene, it was open from 1963 to the late 1969. We would like to speak to anybody that worked there, or any girls or kids that frequented that club back then, or have any knowledge of what type of environment, atmosphere, and the demographic of people that may have hung out there. Myself, with that information, that I had done a lot of investigative work and interviews with people like that. A lot of employees, fire, neighbors, old schoolmates. We're just trying to spread the web further to see who could give us information that we don't have already from the KK squad. If you have any information pertaining to this Midtown Jane Doe homicide, if you have any information on Patricia Kathleen Moan from Sunpar, Brooklyn in the 1960s, I ask you to please call Crime Stoppers at 1-18,577. Tip.